Welcome to our conversation with Senator Ted Cruz. I'm Adam Hoffman, Editor-in-Chief of the Princeton Tory, Chair of the Cliosophic Society, and leader of Princeton College Republicans. On behalf of all three of these organizations, I thank the audience for coming, and I thank Senator Cruz for being here with us. We are so honored to have you. No doubt, our moment is capricious. For one reason or another, Americans see disturbances in our democracy and recognize that our 250-year-old republic faces existential threats. In our conversation with Senator Cruz, we will be unafraid to take this uncontroversial claim to perhaps controversial ends. Who and what is disturbing our democracy? Where are we headed, and how do the institutions that are tasked with purveying our nation's norms, universities, fit into this picture? To answer these questions, there is nobody more fitting than Senator Ted Cruz. Senator Cruz received his undergraduate degree from the university in 1992, where he was chair of the Cliosophic Society and a national debate champion. He wrote his thesis, Clipping the Wings of Angels, the history and theory behind the 9th and 10th Amendments of the US Constitution under Professor Robert George. The senator received his JD from Harvard Law School and was an editor at the Harvard Law Review. Senator Cruz went on to clerk on the US Supreme Court for Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Before his election to the United States Senate in 2012, the senator served in George W. Bush's administration and as the Solicitor General of Texas. In the Senate, Senator Cruz has distinguished himself for his courageousness and commitment to the conservative cause. In 2016, Senator Cruz was runner-up in the Republican presidential primary. I've had the privilege to work for and get to know Senator Cruz in the past, and I'm so honored to be introducing him and moderating this conversation. Again, Senator Cruz, I thank you for your leadership on the issues that matter and for joining us this evening. Just 2 weeks out from the 2020 election, I would be remiss if we didn't begin our conversation with reflections on the results. The dust has not quite settled in the presidential election, but the American people did speak with a clear voice. The Democrat Party has gone too far. Ultra-progressive candidates across the country suffered defeats. Americans said that defund the police is just as radical as it is senseless. That fossil fuels remain an indispensable source of jobs and energy. That family values still matter, and that socialism does not work. Especially in the House, Republicans saw success. It seems the squad's politics are not quite as popular with Americans as they are within pockets of woke Twitter. Are the Democrats going to learn their lesson, Senator Cruz? Will the Democrat Party double down on their shift to the radical left or moderate according to the electorate? How powerful is the woke caucus of the Democratic Party?
Well, Adam, it's great to be with you. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And it's great to be with everyone at Princeton. I wish I were there in person, hanging out and getting a chance to visit in person. I look forward in the era post-COVID of having a chance. You guys have an open invitation to come down anytime you like to DC, and we can have a conversation in person. Look, this election, we're at a crazy time in politics. We're at a divided time in politics. We're at an angry time in politics. But I think you're right in what you said about the election, which is in many ways, the results of the election were a repudiation of the agenda of the radical left, and an indication that this country is fundamentally a center-right country. Prior to the election, the media was explaining how we were going to see a massive blue tidal wave, how Democrats were going to substantially increase their majorities in the House, how Democrats were going to take the U.S. Senate, and of course how Biden was going to win. As we look at the results in the Senate, the Democrats did not succeed in taking the Senate. The last 5 days of the election, I was in 5 different states campaigning with my colleagues. I was in North Carolina, Montana, Iowa, Arizona, and Texas. All of those races had been polling in the low single digits, had appeared to be very close. We won 4 of the 5. We won all of them but Arizona. We also lost Colorado, but we picked up a seat in Alabama. So the net of this election cycle so far has been +1 from the Democrats. Now, we've got a runoff on January 5th in Georgia that could change that, and that runoff is extraordinarily important. But at least on Election Day, the voters across the country rejected socialism, rejected abolishing the police, rejected the extreme agenda much of the left is pushing. We also saw that on the House side, where Republicans are going to pick up maybe 10 seats in the House. Not all the results are entirely decided, but in the neighborhood of 10 seats. It's not likely to be enough to give Republicans control of the House, but in a year where Pelosi was believed they were going to make big gains, it was a shocking shift. Not a single Republican incumbent, it appears, has lost. There's 1 seat in California that might not be the case, but assuming Garcia holds on, then it will be a clean sweep of every Republican incumbent in the House prevailed, and we picked up some big new seats as well. So all of that was encouraging. Your question was, all right, where do the Democrats go from here? Do they double down on being leftists and radicals or not? Left to their own devices, I think they are ready to double down. I think the driving forces in the party right now are the extreme left. They're people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and AOC in the House. I think that's where the energy and passion is. And I think much of the direction of the Democrats depends on what happens in Georgia. So they're one of 2 paths in Georgia. Right now, Republicans have a 50-48 lead. 2 Senate seats are on the ballot in Georgia January 5th. I believe it is likely that we either win them both or lose them both. I think they're likely to go as a pair. If we win them both and we go into next year with a Republican majority, 52-48, then I think that provides, if we have a Joe Biden presidency, it provides some major impetus for Biden and a Biden administration to consider something in the realm of bipartisan cooperation. If, on the other hand, the Democrats win those seats and you have a Schumer Senate and a Pelosi House and a Biden administration, if that happens, I think it's Katie bar the door. I think the extreme left drives the agenda, and I don't see any of that leadership. I don't see Schumer or Pelosi or Biden standing up to the extreme left. So I think Georgia will make a meaningful difference in what direction the Democratic Party goes, because without a majority, a Biden administration would be forced to deal with Republicans in the Senate. With a majority, I think it's the extreme left that drives the train.
Thank you for your insights, Senator. Let's now think about an issue less pressing, but perhaps just as consequential: the state of the American university. Princeton's 6th president, John Witherspoon, called on American colleges to produce, quote, ornaments of the state as well as the church. Princeton was to produce leaders of society. To achieve this, Witherspoon believed that students needed exposure to all ideas, even those which he himself disagreed with. Princeton historian Frank Craven summarized Witherspoon's attitude this way: Witherspoon believed in laying out contending points of view and relying upon persuasive reasoning to guide students toward a proper conclusion of their own. In other words, Witherspoon believed in a culture of open inquiry. That was the Princeton of then. The Princeton of now, as you know, seems very different. This past summer, Professor Joshua Katz was canceled for sharing his personal beliefs in an online article. In response to Katz's opinion, the university administration offered a chilling statement that they will, quote, be looking into the matter further. While they have since backed down, their message was clear: unpopular opinions are to be met with top-down consequences. This was Princeton's particular foray with cancel culture, but we are not alone. Universities across the country are at a juncture. Will universities be a place for open discussion and a hub of debate, or re-education camps of the soft totalitarian left? Senator Cruz, what can and ought the federal government do to ensure that the nation has places to think and study, to live the vida contemplativa, to produce Witherspoon's ornaments of the state as well as the church? What can and ought the federal government do to protect free speech on campus?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a complicated question. Let me break it into two pieces. Let me start with just the issue of what is desirable and what we should want to see in colleges and universities, and then I'll end with what policy levers there might be to encourage that outcome. I think universities should be places of free speech and open discussion and the embrace of wildly different ideas and the intersection of wildly different ideas. I think university is all about challenging what you thought you knew, what you thought you believed, helping you learn how to encounter ideas that are new and difficult. And you know, I will say the political left, there was a time when the political left embraced notions of free speech. If you look at fundamental free speech decisions where the left, the ACLU, was founded embracing unpopular speech. There were leaders in the Senate, Democrats, who embraced free speech. Today's left has a different view. Today's left, and we see it concentrated the most in university campuses, enforces a rigid uniformity, enforces a punishment for views that disagree. Look, I got to say, look, the folks on this call are primarily conservatives at Princeton. You guys are engaged, whether it is in the Tory or Whig-Clio, and I don't know how I would have survived as a student at Princeton today, because the attitude of the left of punishing and silencing speech, I think is really dangerous. Now, all of us know to be a conservative at a college campus, and this was true when I was there, you're outnumbered. You are surrounded by people culturally of the left, both in college and law school. I took quite a few courses from avowed Marxists, and I think Marxism is an evil doctrine that has produced suffering and misery and torture and death. But from my perspective, I wanted to learn exactly what the left thought. You know, my dad referred to my time at Princeton and Harvard as missionary work. Not in the sense of learning how to reason and understand. I think Whig-Clio has a fantastic tradition of that. It was sophomore year when I was chairman of the Clio party. Very good friend of mine, Rob Marks, was the speaker of the Whigs. Rob was and is a liberal. He lives in Bethesda, Maryland. He's a Democrat. Great debater. We had vigorous debates. I will say one of the advantages then, I don't think we took ourselves too seriously. So we'd have vigorous debates, and I'd call Rob a communist, and he'd call me a fascist, and we'd go out and get a beer. Like it wasn't a blood duel. Rob texted me the other day a fairly clever, smart aleck comment. He said, the only way Trump's getting to 270 is if he drops 50 pounds. Like, damn, Rob, that's stout, but it's the line of a Princeton former speaker of the Whigs. There was a sense that we can disagree without hating each other. That we can have conversations, really vigorous, passionate conversations without hating each other. I worry that at college campuses, that's going away, that people are afraid to speak out. My sense of it, although I'm not there, and I would love, one of the reasons I wish we were in person is I'd love to hear from you guys how Princeton is right now. I remember when I was looking at schools, I looked at a number of schools, did a drive with my parents up and down the Ivy League looking at different schools. One of the reasons I went to Princeton is there were at least some conservatives, not a majority, not even close to a majority, but looking at it, there was at least, you know, a tiny foothold of people who wouldn't think I was stark raving nuts. That was helpful. I will say 2017, I was back on campus. It was my 25th reunion. By the way, as an aside, you will be shocked how quickly you get to your 25th reunion. They give you the ugly orange and black sports coat, which my wife Heidi said, "Oh my God, that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen." I said, "Actually, this is really mild for a reunion's sports coat." Our class was understated. You know, when I showed up spring of 2017 for my 25th reunion, it was right after Donald Trump had been sworn in. You guys remember that was a pretty intense and divisive time. I wasn't entirely sure what the reaction was going to be coming back to campus. And I will say it was, over the course of the weekend, I think there were 2 or 3 gray-haired liberals who mustered up the courage to yell "F you" at me, and they felt you could see the frisson of excitement as they did that and then scuttled off. But beyond that, it was great to be back on campus, and we did something that I'd done at my 10th reunion, which is we did in McCosh 10. I sat down with Robbie George, and we had, I don't remember, like a 45-minute conversation that was interesting and positive and respectful and substantive. And I thought that was interesting that at least the Princeton of 2017 was still able to do that, even in the hyper-partisan, charged environment we're in. I worry about the direction universities are going. By the way, when the left tries to silence dissenting views, we should recognize that is a statement of weakness. It's a statement of fear. The folks, look, as believers in free markets, I don't want to silence socialists. Their ideas don't work. They're welcome to prattle on as long as they want, and I'm happy to engage them on substance. The censors are the ones that don't want to actually engage on the merits or substance. And so I think the biggest part of the solution is actually not the federal government in terms of how to fix this problem. I think it's actually the people on this call. I think it is the student body of Princeton and hopefully maybe a couple of courageous professors, but they're not going to be many. But I think it's students who stand up and engage and push back and defend the principles of free speech. There are different levers that can be employed when it comes to federal dollars and potentially putting strings on federal dollars if a university is silencing speech. And I think those solutions are worth considering. I also think those solutions are not going to fly in a Nancy Pelosi house. So the answer right now, don't count on Congress riding to the rescue. They're also not going to fly in a Joe Biden administration. So it's really got to be the students there who stand up and defend free speech with a smile. And that's one thing I would encourage y'all as well. The left today is so angry. They're shrill. They're often hateful. We should not respond in kind. We should respond as happy warriors. We should respond joyfully. Freedom works. We're defending principles that lift up the human soul, that produce prosperity, that defend mankind's inalienable rights. Those are good and happy and powerful principles to defend, and I think y'all are on the front lines of doing it.
Thank you, Senator. American universities are also facing a threat from abroad, from China. It is no secret that technological supremacy is the key to dominance in the 21st century. If we hope to preserve a world order grounded in American values, the United States must maintain its technological edge. Yet our universities, a frontier for research and innovation, have not been reliable partners. Instead of helping America advance in this new age, many professors are abetting in Chinese espionage. Certain graduate students come to the US not to learn and contribute to the American ecosystem, but to steal research and undermine our national security. Recent arrests of professors at Harvard University and the University of Arkansas, and the growth of the Confucius Institutes, an organ of the Chinese Communist Party itself, only makes this point clear. Last year, you introduced the Stop Higher Education Espionage Theft Act, which sought to prevent Chinese espionage at US universities. Recently, Senator Tom Cotton introduced the Secure Campus Act to prohibit Chinese nationals from receiving visas to the United States for graduate and postgraduate studies in STEM fields. Senator, what are the considerations that must be taken into account on an issue as fragile as education? How far ought we go to stop China's Communist Party from undermining our national security through the infiltration of our universities?
Well, Adam, I think that is a fantastic question, and it's a really important question. As we look out across the globe, I believe Communist China will be the single greatest geopolitical threat facing the United States for the next century. I think in many ways we are in another Cold War, but with an adversary that may prove far more formidable than the Soviet Union was. The Chinese Communist government has behind it 1.3 billion people and an economy with a potential to be far more formidable than the Soviets ever were. And when it comes to the communist government in China, I think we need to be clear-eyed. I think we need to have a systematic strategy for combating it. That includes a number of elements. One of the elements is speaking truth and shining light. It is difficult to overstate just how important sunlight is and just how much tyrannies fear sunlight. The Chinese Communist government, they are murderers, they are torturers. They have right now over 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. And when it comes to the specific topic you asked about, which is espionage, look, there has always been the threat of theft or espionage. As long as there's been property, as long as there's been ideas, people have tried to steal them. What is different, and we've never seen in the history of mankind, is a nation state with billions or even trillions of dollars behind it, engaged in the systematic effort to steal intellectual property, to steal technology, to engage in global espionage the way the Chinese communists are doing right now. Last fall in October, I traveled to Asia and did an Asia tour where I went to Pearl Harbor and then Japan and then Taiwan and then India and then Hong Kong. And it was designed to really be a friends and allies tour, to go to major allies in the region, all surrounding China, all dealing with the growing threat of China militarily, economically, diplomatically. One of the things when I met with the Pacific Command at Pearl Harbor, they talked about the military buildup of China, where they have relied on, in significant part, intellectual property, military innovation stolen from us, so that they're not investing in the same R&D, but rather they're relying on espionage to steal technology and leapfrog ahead. And their investments on the military front are massive and profoundly challenging in the years and decades ahead. When it comes to universities, I think many universities have been hopelessly naive. They're not used to being targeted by a nation state for systematic infiltration and theft. I can tell you a major research institution in Texas that I've spoken to many, many times, where they dealt with faculty members there who were Chinese nationals who were on the payroll of the Chinese Communist government, who were receiving substantially more from the Chinese government than they were receiving from the host institution, and who were engaging in active theft of ideas. And in fact, they would be engaged in research, and we're talking in this instance non-military research. So this is not missile technology or the next fighter jet. This is non-military research. They'd be engaging in cutting-edge research, and suddenly a Chinese company would file for a U.S. patent on the identical research they were working on. It had been stolen and just handed over, trying to essentially take advantage of the U.S. legal system to steal intellectual property. I think this threat is more widespread than we have realized, and in the Senate, I have engaged in a comprehensive strategy to try to combat it, to try to fight it on multiple fronts, on the espionage front, on the propaganda front, on the censorship front, on the military front, on the economic front. You have to take another element of the Chinese threat. We have seen during the coronavirus pandemic the vulnerability of our supply chain, where the Chinese government systematically targeted U.S. industries, targeted pharmaceutical production, and developed capacity and then slashed prices to drive out of business U.S. production, to make us entirely dependent on Chinese production, to acquire monopolies in critical infrastructure. And in the midst of this pandemic, one state-owned newspaper in China explicitly called for cutting off life-saving medicines from the United States as a tool of economic warfare. And I think the degree to which we have made ourselves vulnerable to a dangerous communist government is very significant. And combating it, I've spent a lot of time urging universities to be more aware of this threat and to fight against it, but also using the tools of government to fight against it as well.
Thank you, Senator. We'll now move to the audience Q&A. Quite a few of you submitted questions with your registration. As I move through several pre-selected questions, some serious and some fun, please submit your questions via the Q&A function. Our first question is from Junior Harrison Snowden. Only 1% of Harvard's faculty is conservative. Princeton is similarly liberal. Do you see this changing? What can we do?
I don't know. So it's interesting. The Harvard Law faculty has actually gotten more conservative. At Princeton, so when I was at Princeton, there was one outspoken faculty member who was conservative, and that was Robbie George. Robbie was a relatively young professor at the time. It was actually kind of funny because Robbie took a sabbatical to go serve as a fellow at the U.S. Supreme Court. And while he took a sabbatical, there was a visiting professor named Russell Hittinger who came in, who was also conservative. And they gave Professor Hittinger the same phone number as Robbie. And he kind of laughed at it, that their view was, one conservative crank, just call him and you'll get whatever view is there. Look, it's a challenge. It is a challenge that goes back, it goes back really to the 1960s, where the radical left had a systematic process of seizing control of the organs of transmission of ideas. And universities were a critical element of that. And with tenure, they're not terribly interested in allowing dissenting views. What the least diversity one gets today on a college campus is ideological diversity. So I mentioned Harvard Law School has diversified some. That actually traces it, ironically enough, to Elena Kagan. So Elena Kagan, before she was on the Supreme Court, was the dean of Harvard Law School. And Elena came from the political world. She'd worked in the Clinton White House. And it was interesting. So Elena, when I was a student at Harvard Law, there was one open Republican on the faculty, Charles Freed, who I worked for, was Ronald Reagan's Solicitor General, brilliant litigator and scholar. But he was the only open Republican. What Elena did systematically is she recruited a handful of other Republicans. And I think she understood that, listen, if you have a faculty of, about 80 professors, the world's not going to end if there are 5 conservatives instead of 1. But what did change is an awful lot of conservatives were incredibly gratified. And actually, Elena did something else that was very savvy. She sought out conservative alums and presented distinguished awards. So there was something called the Trephagen Distinguished Alumnus Award, which at the time I was the Solicitor General down in Texas. She awarded one to me. She awarded one to Rachel Brand, who'd been in the Bush Justice Department. And it was a very systematic effort where they flew you back to campus and you gave a talk and you got a little certificate where, you know, they say you're not the spawn of the devil devouring live kittens under the empty moonlight. All of that, I thought at the time, and in hindsight I think even more so, was a systematic effort. She wanted to be on the Supreme Court. That was her objective, and when it came to being nominated, she ended up having much less Republican opposition, I think because she had not treated conservatives like lepers throwing rocks at them. She'd maintained a hard liberal control of the faculty, but she'd let to mix my metaphors, a camel's nose under the tent. So it is possible. I would think the hopes of doing so will come from really two avenues. Number one, the students calling for ideological diversity. And number two, the alums and the donors demanding it. But look, there is a bumpy history of universities basically of hardcore radicals not caring. And so I don't have a magic solution to it other than continuing to press for free and open debate.
Senior Abraham Wasserstein, RCA in 1915 Hall, asks, I'm super excited to listen, but my 1915 RCAZs have always wanted to know what room you lived in. So, Senator, if you remember which room in 1915 Hall you lived in, that is the question.
I don't. All right, it was too long ago. I can probably figure it out by like searching my credit records. That's one of the ways where like old addresses. I don't know, but I'll tell you what, I will ask. So my roommate and best friend in college was David Panton. He may remember better than I do, so when I'm done with this, I'll text David, and if he remembers, Adam, I'll let you know, but I just don't remember now. I was in Butler first 2 years, but I don't remember which dorm rooms.
That sounds great. Sophomore Reed Zlotke asks, how has or will your voting record reflect your respect for the 10th Amendment when it comes to drug policy reform?
Yeah, great question. My view on when it comes to drug policies is that it's a question for the states. And so that has long been, I've differed with many Republicans on that question. It was interesting, in 2016, running for president, the coalition we assembled was, in the primary, was really far-reaching. And we had a coalition of conservatives, we had a coalition of constitutionalists, we had a coalition of evangelicals, we had libertarians, we had folks across the spectrum. With a lot of the libertarians, it was interesting, a lot of the folks who had been in Iowa and New Hampshire, who had been Ron Paul's leadership, who were hard libertarians, I'd sit down and meet with them, and I'd have very candid conversations. And I'd say, listen, I am not a libertarian. I am not where Ron Paul is, and obviously Ron's son Rand was running against me, so they had Rand as a choice. But I said, I have a lot of libertarian leanings, and so let's have a candid conversation about where we agree, where we disagree, and you can decide if that's a bundle of positions and attributes that you find attractive. And so on drugs, what I'd say is, many libertarians, obviously most libertarians, advocate for legalizing drugs. I understand the arguments for that. I have wrestled with the arguments on drug legalization. I don't support it myself. So if legalizing marijuana were on the ballot, say in Texas, as a citizen of Texas, I would vote no. But I would leave it to the states, and I readily acknowledge reasonable minds can disagree. And one of the reasons I would leave it to the states is that I very much think, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis referred to the states as laboratories of democracy. One of the real virtues of federalism is not every state's the same. I mean, you wouldn't expect California to adopt the same laws as Texas. You wouldn't expect Alabama to adopt the same laws as New York. I mean, we have a wide diversity in our country. And on the question of drug legalization, so there are lots of policy arguments about, well, the crime and violence comes because it's illegal. And if you legalize it and regulate it, you can eliminate the violence and you can have treatment. And those arguments are not unreasonable on their face. What we're seeing now, as more and more states, particularly with marijuana, are legalizing it, is we're actually seeing what happens. And I think the results, you look at states that were kind of on the cutting edge of that, states like Colorado, I think as we move forward, the data and evidence there will drive it. If we see crime rates going up, if we see property values going down, if we see more and more young people getting trapped in drug addiction, my guess is other states will be less eager to go down that road. If, on the other hand, the promised utopia actually materializes, you'll probably see other states follow that. And so I think, and I actually think federalism solves a lot of the divisive issues in our country. That if we leave it to the states, we can see policy ideas that work and policy ideas that don't, and people could vote with their feet. They can choose where they want to live, and one of the problems of the left, their ideas don't work, and so they want to force them on the entire country. Let's take, for example, socialized medicine. Big idea of the left. So there are 50 states. Ask yourself right now, how many states have socialized medicine? The Democrats have total control over the state of California. They have the governor and massive majorities in both legislatures. Do you know how many impediments there are to socialized medicine in California? 0. They could do it right now. No Republican can stop them. Why haven't they? Because it doesn't work. Because they don't have the money. They debated it and looked at it and said, holy cow, we can't make this work. And you know what? If we do this, the people fleeing our state, the small businesses running away, the people looking for jobs, that will only escalate. And so what do they want to do instead? They want to do it nationally, force it on all 50 states, so you can't escape. Unless you're willing to leave America, you're stuck. If their ideas are so good, there's no constitutional impediment to a state adopting socialized medicine, but their economy may well see the downsides. Their citizens may well see the downsides of rationing and scarcity and waiting lines and all of the things that have attended socialized medicine in other countries, but you don't see the left wanting to do that, and I think we can solve a lot of our problems by defending the 10th Amendment. It's why I wrote my senior thesis on the 10th Amendment. I've believed in federalism since I was a teenager.
Thank you, Senator. Junior Jane Metzinger asks, what was your favorite topic to discuss when you did college debate? How has your understanding of those topics changed?
So I love debate. When I showed up at Princeton in the fall of 1988, I'd never done debate. So I went to a little bitty high school in Houston. It's called Second Baptist High School. My graduating class was 43, and my high school didn't have a debate team. So I guess if there's anything geekier than being a debater, it's being a debater wannabe, which is what I was. I thought debate looked really cool, and we didn't have it. So I showed up at Princeton and immediately went to Whig-Cliosophic and signed up, said I want to do this, and spent the next 4 years virtually every single weekend debating, and loved it. Spent a lot of time kind of systematically diving into it. I mentioned David Panton, who was my debate partner. He's Jamaican. He grew up in Jamaica, and we became roommates, and we're best friends to this day. And David and I together, after a tournament, we made a systematic study of how to win at debate, and analyzed it at great length. So when we'd get back from a tournament, late Saturday night, sometimes it'd be midnight, 1, 2 in the morning, I would make us sit down in the dorm room with all of our ballots from the tournament and go over them that night. And go over them at great length, reading through it, rehashing the round. If we'd lost the round, we'd spend an hour talking about, all right, how could we have won that round? What did we do wrong? What should we have done better? Even if we'd won that round, we'd say, all right, how could we have won it more decisively? How could we have gotten more speaker points? And we'd go through hypotheticals. Okay, if we were the other side, how would we counter that? And we'd try to analyze it. And David, about 3 or 4 in the morning, would be like, enough! Get out of my room! Leave me alone! I must sleep! But that process of analyzing and breaking it down, by the way, a lot of debaters, when they lose, they look for an extrinsic source to blame. So they say, oh, the judge was an idiot. That's why I lost. It's just the terrible judge. I think terrible judge is a cop-out. The example I used to use is, all right, what would the consummate debater do? Well, if your judge was a potted plant, he or she would emit so much light that the plant would grow in your direction. Like, if you have a lousy judge, all right, figure out how to do it. Figure out how to be persuasive. And so a couple of things sort of breaking down debate theory. One of the things, actually, my new book that came out about 6 weeks ago called One Vote Away, How a Single Supreme Court Seat Can Change History. I talk about the strategy that David and I used in debate and how that same strategy later was applied to litigating in front of the Supreme Court and to political arguments, which is, so as leader of the opposition, the leader of opposition constructive speech was my second favorite speech. Prime Minister rebuttal is my favorite speech. Prime Minister rebuttal is the most amazing 4 minutes in all of debate. But the leader of opposition speech is particularly exhilarating because, as you know, you sit down in a round and you don't know what the topic is. And you've got, the other side will get up and they'll spend a minute or two futzing around and not saying anything. Finally, they'll tell you what the heck you're debating. And so you've got 6-7 minutes to figure it out, anticipate what they're going to say, and design your opposition. Most debaters, and I think it has moved more in this direction, the debate circuit, than even when I was there, but come from a policy background where they're writing a debate flow and they're tracking the arguments. And so the Prime Minister laid out 5 arguments. They have argument 1, here's my response. Argument 2, here's my response. And as you guys know, at the end of the day, the flow of arguments across the 6 columns is point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. David and I developed a different strategy, which is leader of opposition. I'd hear the case, and instead of responding nit by nit, an individual point by individual point, I would start writing a Prime Minister speech. The thesis of which, if their case was X, was not X. The thesis of which was, actually not even that, is their case is wrong. And I would present an affirmative speech on why their case is wrong, not because this little premise or that little premise is wrong, but rather I'd present the affirmative presentation for the other side. What it would end up looking like, they were the strangest flows in the world, because you'd have the Prime Minister's speech with 3, 4, 5 points, and then the judge would kind of scratch their head and not be sure what to do, but would just write my 3, 4, 5 points at the bottom of the flow. And then the member of government would respond to my 3, 4, 5 points. Then David would be the member of opposition. He would continue the flow. Now, he'd make a point of, you'd get these policy sticklers that would be like, okay, you can't drop any argument, even if it's utterly inconsequential. So he would drop a tab on each of the little arguments just so they're not unresponded to. But at the end of it, we would subsume the flow. We would totally just capture the entire debate and put it on the terrain we wanted to. That strategy of how to do that was a lot of fun. We also, particularly senior year, David and I got really tired of debaters who just whined, who, like, whatever case you ran, they got up and said, it's a truism, it's a tautology, it's just so unfair, wah, wah, wah. And that was just boring. I didn't like being in a round where all they were doing was whining about how unfair it was, rather than man up and go defend the thing. So we started doing what at the time was called a Wellesley, because debaters from Wellesley had begun doing it, which is we'd raise an issue. Capital punishment should be abolished. And I'd stand up and say, all right, this is the issue we want to discuss. And I'd turn to the opposition as prime minister and I'd say, we're happy to take either side of it. Which side do you want? And would do it in live debate. And it would, sometimes they wouldn't play along and wouldn't pick, but usually they'd pick a side. And I'd have two outlines, so I'd crumble one and throw it over my shoulder and present the other side. The beauty of doing that is once they picked their side, there was no more whining about how unfair the case was. Like once they picked the side, you could have a real substantive debate on the merits. And so that senior year, virtually every case we did as the government, that's the way we approached it. We actually had some really good, lively debates as a result.
I hope our members of the debate panel were taking notes on that. So sophomore Billy Wade asks, what advice would you give a Princeton conservative considering a career in politics or public policy?
Lots of things. Use your time at Princeton to learn. I actually think the skills particularly in debate were immensely useful. Learning how to think, learning how to understand the other side's arguments. So many people in public life caricature the other side. They think of anyone who disagrees with them as either stupid or evil. And the truth of the matter is most people aren't. Yes, there are some stupid people and some evil people on planet Earth, but most people are not. And if you want to actually persuade someone, you need to understand in your gut how someone of good intelligence, of good morals, of integrity, of character could look at the issue you care most about and come to 180 degrees the opposite conclusion. You need to think about how your mother could take that issue and understand it. If you want to persuade people, you need to be able to get in their shoes and understand why they believe what they believe and not engage in don't attack straw men. One of the things that I've tried to do is engage in real ideas. So back a couple of years ago, I did 3 CNN town hall debates with Bernie Sanders on health care and tax policy. And the great thing about Bernie is he is an unapologetic socialist. So he embraces socialism. I embrace free enterprise. And so each of them was 90 minutes. They were deeply substantive, but we didn't stand there and just insult each other and say the other guy is evil. We talked about ideas. I think use your time to learn how to do that. And then I would say if you're interested in the political world, pick an issue or two that you care about and pour your heart into it. Go build a record fighting for an issue that matters. I knew I wanted to run from office since I was a very young child. My dad's personal history, having fought in the Cuban Revolution, having been imprisoned and tortured. I mean, I grew up as a kid listening to my dad tell me stories of freedom fighters. It's what I wanted to do. But as I thought about it, I didn't want to run for office and have to tell people, just trust me on this. So we've all seen too many politicians that lie, that just tell us what we want to hear and they break their word. I wanted instead to be able to run on a record where if you wanted to know what I thought, you could point to the record and say, look, here's what I believe because I've been in the trenches. I have the stripes from fighting for these principles. So for me, an issue I'm deeply passionate about is school choice. I've spent 30 years very actively involved in the school choice movement and fighting on it and building a record. So I would say if you want to get involved in politics, pick an issue you care about and go roll up your sleeves and go to work to make a difference on that issue.
And our last question here, Senator, is from Carson Makonga. what is the right time to acknowledge publicly that Joe Biden has won the election? What factors or conditions would need to be met for Republican senators to ask the president to concede?
Well, listen, the legal proceedings need to be over, and there needs to be a clear and undisputed winner. The way elections operate, this is not the first election that has been contested where the results have been disputed. We see that with some regularity. There will be an answer. Somebody will be sworn in on January 20th. Right now, the vote totals, it's clear that Joe Biden's in the lead, but there's multiple lawsuits that are pending. Earlier this year, I launched a podcast called Verdict with Ted Cruz. We put it out typically about once a week. We launched it in January during impeachment. It became the #1 ranked podcast in the world. And each week, it's about 30 minutes that I try to really get into substance and engage on the issues. So the last one I did was on this question. So if you want a 30-minute answer instead of what will be about a 3 or 4 minute answer, you can go listen to my last podcast where I went through the legal issues and the status. There are multiple recounts and or contest lawsuits pending. And under our constitutional system, we have courts that can adjudicate those matters, that can determine factual disputes, that can determine legal questions. And I'll point as an analogy to 2000. So in 2000 was the last time we had a contested presidential elections. Most of y'all either were not born or were very little babies in 2000. For me, I was actually a young lawyer. So I was working on the George W. Bush campaign, and I ended up becoming one of the lawyers representing George W. Bush and Bush versus Gore. And I'll just recount a little bit of that history because that may be helpful in terms of assessing where we are now. And actually, this story I describe at much greater length. I mentioned before my book, One Vote Away. Every chapter is on a different major Supreme Court battle. And so there's one chapter on Bush versus Gore where I recount the inside story of what that fight was about. On election night, initially the networks called the election for Al Gore. They called Florida for Al Gore. They called the presidential for Al Gore. I still remember that night, Dan Rather from CBS News gloating. I mean, look, Rather's a big liberal. He was so happy that Al Gore had beaten George W. Bush. They actually called the Florida election even before the polls were closed in Florida because the Panhandle's in the Central Time Zone. And so they were, and it's also the most conservative part of the state. So while conservatives were still voting, the network called Florida for Al Gore. Turned out they were wrong. And as the votes were counted, it was clear that what they'd called in Florida was incorrect. So as the evening went on, the networks all uncalled it. And then as the evening went on later that night, the networks called Florida for George W. Bush. And so said, George W. Bush has won the state of Florida. And then the networks called the entire presidential race. George W. Bush is the next president of the United States. Al Gore picked up the phone, called George W. Bush and conceded, said, I concede, you win. And so Bush was on his way to give his victory speech. I still remember being out on Congress Avenue in Austin, getting ready to listen to a victory speech, and suddenly Al Gore calls him back and retracts his concession. And you can kind of see George W. Bush, what do you mean? What do you mean? You're taking it back? Well, the totals in Florida were quite close. And so the next day, Gore sent an army of lawyers into Florida. They filed multiple lawsuits. I got on a plane the day after that, flew to Tallahassee. I was down in Florida for the entirety of the recount. It was utter chaos. Some of the books and movies that have been written about Florida, they portray it as, this mastermind strategy. Jim Baker's an amazingly talented, ruthless knife fighter, was remarkable leading the Bush team, but it was utter chaos. I remember our war room, we had a whiteboard on the wall and a chart of all the lawsuits. And I think there were 7 different lawsuits that were all pending at the same time, any one of which could have cost the presidency of the United States. And 36 days of chaos. During those 36 days, we had a full trial on the merits in Florida State Court. We had multiple other state court proceedings. We had 2 arguments before the Florida Supreme Court, full briefing, arguments and decisions from the Florida Supreme Court, and we had 2 arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court, full briefing, oral argument, and decisions from the Supreme Court. That whole process took 36 days. That actually shows the legal process can move with some expedition to resolve these claims. During the whole course of that time, the media didn't refer to George W. Bush as the president-elect. You know, Biden, I think, is pretty ridiculous putting up little signs that say Office of the President-elect, which I guess they printed on a laser printer. The media didn't refer to Bush as the president-elect, even though he was leading and they had actually previously called the race for him. There was an ongoing legal dispute and the matter was not resolved. When it went the second time to the U.S. Supreme Court, the night the decision came down, I still remember the clerk of the Supreme Court called my cell phone and said, "We've got a decision." And she asked, she was an old friend of mine, the deputy clerk actually, she asked me, she said, "You want me to fax it to you?" So that actually shows the time. You know, this is December of 2000, so we still had fax machines. So I said, "Sure, fax it to me." And so she faxed it. I don't remember, it was about 10 o'clock at night. I pull the decision off and I walk into Jim Baker's office. And the decision, if you go back and read it, it doesn't say right at the beginning, here's what the outcome is. I mean, it's fairly dense and complicated. And so Baker asked me, says, "Well, what does it say?" So I'm sitting there in a little darkened room and I'm trying to read this Supreme Court decision very quickly. And Baker is standing right across from me, kind of looking over my shoulder. On the TVs, you have reporters who are standing on the steps of the Supreme Court. They've got the opinion. They can't figure out what it means. They're literally reading it going, "We've got an opinion. We're not sure what this means." So I take a couple of minutes. I read through it. And then I said to Baker, I said, "It means it's over. We've won." And he looks at me. He nods. He reaches over. He picks up the phone. He calls Crawford, Texas, the ranch. That's where George W. Bush was. And Bush answers the phone, and Baker's first words, he says, "Well, Mr. President, how does it feel?" And I had chills run down my spine. When it was over, when it was decided, when the matter was concluded, that's when he became president-elect. I will say, a couple of days later, Heidi, who was at the time my girlfriend and obviously now my wife, Heidi's comment was, "It's a good thing you were right." And it was a good point. Look, as a 29-year-old, it's a little terrifying if I had missed some footnote in the opinion, reading it rapidly late at night. It would have been a pretty serious mistake, but thankfully I didn't. That's how the process is meant to operate, and these legal challenges will be resolved, and we'll have a clear outcome, and that's the way the constitutional system is meant to work.
Thank you, Senator, for this rich conversation. We are so honored to have had you.
It's been a lot of fun, and I have deep, warm feelings for my time, particularly at Princeton debate. I will say, by the way, my last debate as Clio chairman, my whip, one of my whips was David Panton, my best friend, and the last case we presented in Princeton was that Princeton should abolish affirmative action based on race. And we actually argued that Princeton should shift to economic affirmative action instead, that you should look for low-income students, for people who are the first in their family going to college, but Princeton shouldn't make explicit distinction based on race. And I got to say, for college leftists, that they were flabbergasted how you could have an Hispanic man and a black man presenting the conservative case for stop discriminating based on race, but we made that argument, and it ended up the floor vote that night. We won. I think we won about 2-1, but that may be a little bit of fish story memories where I may be exaggerating the margin somewhat, but we definitely won, and it was encouraging that the Princeton students who came there were willing to vote for the conservative position. I think there is hope for Princeton, and frankly, I think you guys are the hope, so keep speaking the truth with a smile, keep defending the Constitution, and keep defending liberty.
Thank you so much, Senator. And thank you to the audience for attending this event. If you enjoyed tonight's discussion and are not already a member, please consider joining College Republicans in Clio. Please also visit theprincetontory.com for insightful commentary on culture, politics, and the university. Again, Senator, thank you. This concludes our event for this evening. Thank you all.